Hello! In this video, I'll be talking about the political status of the region of Crimea and the way that it's approached geopolitically and in the media, while comparing it to that of Taiwan throughout. This comparison will be used as a springboard for a broader look at the concept of the principle of self-determination of peoples and nations. Things like how said principle actually tends to be applied in practice, how it ought to work ideally, and whether it's even really still applicable in much of the world today. We'll also be more briefly covering some other contemporary cases where the principle of self-determination is often invoked, such as Scotland, Catalonia, the Falklands/Malvinas Islands, and Palestine. This is a very open-ended topic without any possibility for a clear, objective sort of answer, so there'll be lots of room for discussion on this in the comment section afterwards. Let's get started. In 2014, the pro-Russian president of Ukraine was ousted as a result of the Euromaidan protest movement and replaced with a pro-Western rival. This had immediate ramifications in some of the eastern parts of Ukraine, where there are significant ethnic Russian populations, and especially in the very strategically important port region of Crimea, which has an outright ethnic Russian majority. Crimea has also been a part of Ukraine for a relatively short period of time, as it was handed over to it by the USSR in 1954. So Crimea is kind of in a weird position where it doesn't neatly slot in as an obvious part of either state. This is mostly because before the 19th century, it was inhabited not mostly by Russians nor Ukrainians, but rather by Crimean Tatars, who have gradually become a minority over the last 200 years as they have been subject to displacement, combined with the arrival of more and more Ukrainians and Russians. The regions thus lacked a clear, unified identity for a very long time. Nonetheless, most of its population has long favored strong ties with Russia. In both the 2004 and 2010 Ukrainian presidential elections, Crimeans voted overwhelmingly for Yanukovych, the pro-Russian president who was later overthrown in 2014. These were not surprising results, given Crimea's large ethnic Russian population and the fact that it's an important port region on the Russian border, which benefits greatly from economic engagement with its neighbor. In the wake of the drastic shift of the government's geopolitical direction away from Russia and towards the West, Russia invaded Crimea while also supporting so-called declarations of independence by pro-Russian separatists in the Ukrainian regions of Luhansk and Donetsk, further to the east. While these latter maneuvers resulted in a long-term, bloody conflict between Ukraine and Russian proxies, the Crimean invasion went largely uncontested on the ground. A prominent narrative has been pushed since then, and especially since Russia's further 2022 invasion of the rest of Ukraine, which dictates that these regions have been taken over by Russia against the will of their populations, and that most people there are longing to be liberated via rejoining Ukraine. The lack of majority support for independence or Russian annexation is more than likely accurate for most of the occupied territories. There exists little to no reliable evidence that most people in Luhansk or Donetsk supported independence before or after the 2014 invasion, and there's even less evidence for majority consent for their further September 2022 annexations of Kherson and Zaporizhia. Russia conducted referendums that they claim to have passed with overwhelming approval, but referendums conducted by an occupying military force are hardly a reliable indication of the will of the population. And look, if you're gonna fake the results of a vote, you should at least do it in a believable manner. Results like 99% approval just make things look very suspect, and claiming 95% turnout in the middle of a war is possibly even sketchier. Crimea is a very different story though. While the questionable referendum was conducted there back in 2014 as well, it's 100% possible for that referendum to have been conducted improperly, but for its results to nonetheless reflect the will of most of the population. And this can be confirmed via corroboration by independent polls. And most polls show that a majority of Crimeans were in favor of joining Russia even before 2014. A 2008 poll by the Ukrainian Center for Economic and Political Studies found that 63.8% of Crimeans were in favor of succession from Ukraine to join Russia, including 55% of ethnic Ukrainians. And a series of 7 polls conducted by the United Nations Development Programme over the course of 2 years from 2009 to 2011 consistently found that more than 65% of Crimeans wished for Crimea to become a part of Russia. Further polls conducted from 2014 onwards show that this clear majority only grew. A number of polls were able to be carried out before and after the referendum on joining Russia, and all of them confirm the referendum results as being an accurate representation of the will of most of the population. In fact, they all show that even more Crimeans wanted to join Russia then, with the percentages jumping from the 60s to the 80s. This makes it clear that the drastic sudden shift to a pro-Western, anti-Russian government in 2014 further solidified the desire to join Russia among most of the Crimean population. It also appears to have created a sense of urgency to actually do so, whereas beforehand, people seem to have been more content to remain part of Ukraine, even if it might not have been their first preference. The rest of the polls that we're about to go over were conducted by companies that are very much not Russia-aligned. In fact, they are all respected polling agencies in the Western world who, if anything, were actually far more likely to have been biased against Russia. Before the referendum, GfK Group, Germany's largest polling company, found that 70.6% of Crimeans intended to vote for joining Russia. Then, after the referendum, a poll was conducted by Gallup, one of the most well-regarded American polling companies. They partnered up with the Broadcasting Board of Governors, a US government media agency that is the parent organization of notorious US state propaganda outlets like Voice of America and Radio Free Asia. So yeah, we're not exactly talking about a pro-Russian poll here. This poll found that 83% of Crimeans believe that the referendum results accurately represented the views of the Crimean people. Even a plurality of polled ethnic Ukrainians in Crimea, 68%, believe that the results were legitimate. 74% of all Crimeans additionally responded that they believed their lives would improve due to joining Russia. At the time, these results were reported on without any question in the Western media, including in the aforementioned US state media outlet, Voice of America. So those are already clear results that were accepted pretty willingly by Russia's main geopolitical rivals that show that Russia's claim to have had majority support for annexation in Crimea is true. And there's more. A concurrent poll by Pew Research, another well-regarded American polling organization, found that 91% of Crimeans believe the referendum was free and fair, and that 86% believe the Ukrainian government should acknowledge the results. Then, in early 2015, an organization called Free Crimea, which advocates for Crimea to rejoin Ukraine, so clearly not pro-Russian at all, in fact the exact opposite, commissioned a poll from the Ukrainian branch of the aforementioned German polling agency, GfK. They were hoping to get data that would suit their narrative of Crimea being subjugated against its will and needing to be freed, but they ended up getting the exact opposite. 82% of respondents said that they fully supported Crimea being part of Russia, and 11% expressed partial support, a total of 93%, up from 70% in GfK's previous poll. Later, in 2017, after things had calmed down a bit, the German Center for East European and International Studies, known as ZIOS, carried out a poll that again returned similar results. 86% of non-Tatars and 52% of Tatars believe that the results of the 2014 referendum would be confirmed if it were carried out again on that day. Combined, 79% of Crimeans from all ethnicities said that they themselves would vote yes again. So, pre-referendum, we have at least 9 polls carried out by sources that are clearly not pro-Russian, all clearly indicating majority support for joining Russia. And post-referendum, we have at least 4 polls, all conducted by Western-biased sources, one of them even by an actual US government propaganda arm, and another at the behest of a very pro-Ukraine organization, and they all returned very similar results in favor of annexation. It's very cut and dry. The vast majority of Crimeans wanted to, and still want to be, part of Russia. This is very inconvenient for a lot of geopolitical narratives. In fact, it pretty much rubbishes some of them entirely. There are many pro-Western observers, commentators, governments, and organizations who justify their support of certain movements for independence or self-governance, prominently in Taiwan, for just one example, on the simple notion that they claim the majority of the people who live there should be able to choose their political status. Yet for Crimea, this principle they supposedly hold dear suddenly evaporates operates. They say that Crimea is Ukraine, and call for its immediate return, despite most of the population pretty clearly not wanting that, while painting China's claim to Taiwan, which is certainly at least as valid as Ukraine's to Crimea, as ridiculous. This causes a huge bout of cognitive dissonance in the true believers among them. They recognize fully well that these two positions are fundamentally incompatible with one another. They can see the obvious, everyone can. Either you support the majority choosing their political status in both Crimea and Taiwan, as they're very similar situations, or you support neither. And that goes for people on the other side, by the way, too, who justified Crimean self-determination on the basis of majority rule, but who are against it in Taiwan. So their only options here, aside from acknowledging that they were wrong, of course, which isn't going to happen, are 1. To completely ignore the clear-as-day fact that most Crimeans want to be part of Russia. This is the option that most Western governments have opted to go with, as they constantly issue proclamations that just plain completely ignore the inconvenient facts on the ground, demanding that Crimea be returned to Ukraine without any consideration for what the people who live there want. Or 2, to deny the veracity of these polls and hatch zero-evidence conspiracy theories as to why they should just be offhandedly discarded. The results of the polls are corroborated massively, not just by multiple other polls, but by the overwhelmingly pro-Russian sentiment that was also shown in pre-2014 polls and election results. The results are so clearly in favor of being a part of Russia that even if we were to assume something ridiculous, like that say 1 in 4 positive respondents were being forced to answer yes by Vladimir Putin himself personally holding a gun to their head, there still would have been a solid majority in favor of annexation. I've also seen some of these people claim that the results can't be trusted because some people fled or left Crimea since the Russian annexation, which skewed results in favor of annexation. But the Ukrainian government's own figures show that 1 year following annexation, slightly fewer than 20,000 people had left Crimea for the rest of Ukraine. If we assume that every single one of these people would have voted no in the referendum, that still barely makes a dent to the overwhelming yes vote. There is simply no tenable way to contest the fact that at the very least a plurality of the population of Crimea really did want to become a part of Russia following the 2014 Euromaidan protests. Claim principles suddenly being thrown out the window like this once it's no longer advantageous for one side really lays bare something fundamental about geopolitics, how most people, not just governments, engage with geopolitics, and how ultimately fruitless ethics and morality-based discussions about self-determination, along with many other international topics, actually are in practice. Principles do not actually matter to most of the big players, nor to their supporters. The justifications they use are always simply post hoc. They work backwards. The West's support for Taiwanese self-government and self-determination has nothing whatsoever to do with the usual public-facing justifications of democracy and freedom. If that wasn't already obvious from the fact that they also backed Taiwan for decades beforehand, when it was a brutal military dictatorship, and it certainly has nothing to do with the principle of self-determination. All they care about is the fact that Taiwan is a thorn in the side of China, their geopolitical rival. Having an island which is in a military, economic, and political alliance with them 100 miles away from the mainland of their geopolitical rival is extremely useful for projecting their power in the region and checking China on its own doorstep. So there is no double standard here, because the US and EU are not trying to uphold a set of principles or standards. Rather, their purported principles and standards are just convenient rhetorical devices to be employed when convenient and ignored when not. Their interest in Taiwan, as in everything else, is based solely on doing whatever they believe will be the most beneficial for themselves, and every justification they make for this is crafted from there. Hence them suddenly forgetting about the same principle of self-determination, which they invoke for Taiwan in the Crimean case, is not actually a double standard or inconsistency, even though it really does seem like one. They may not be consistently adhering to a set of claimed principles, but they are consistently pursuing their own interests and consistently crafting whatever haphazard justifications they can muster for doing so. And all of that also goes for Russia. While they may not be nearly as globally influential as the US, the EU, and their other allies are, everything they do geopolitically is based on the same principle of do do what's best for us and come up with whatever justification we can muster for it later. Even in Crimea, where most people actually do want to be part of Russia, this was really just a convenient justification for them to annex a strategically important port region. There's little reason to believe they wouldn't have done it, even without the approval of those who live there, given the fact that they simultaneously also invaded Donetsk and Luhansk, where such things are far less certain, and especially given that they recently proclaimed a bunch more occupied Ukrainian territory, including some Ukrainian territory that have already been kicked out of, as Russian. So it's not very surprising that Russia's position on Taiwan is exactly the opposite of that of the Western Bloc. Despite justifying their annexation of Crimea with the principle of self-determination, they support the People's Republic of China's claim to Taiwan, a seemingly contradictory stance given that public opinion in Taiwan is largely against changing the present status quo. Why? Well, because their Western Bloc opponents use Taiwan as a proxy, so they and China share a common rival. It's really that simple. This is all really just cynical self-interest, and what we see often on social media, with people desperately trying to argue for the often contradictory justifications put forth by the bloc they support, just goes to show the folly of taking them at face value. You're very quickly going to have to do some prime mental gymnastics, reality denying, and propaganda spewing due to the massive, irreconcilable contradictions at play. Everyone would really just be much better off if they just outright said, yeah, I support this because it's what I think is best for my side, and I just really don't care about anything else. It's clear that, in practice, self-determination isn't actually much of a moral or ethical question at all, rather just one of power. The majority of residents of a region get to choose their political status only if they have the power to seize and protect it, or if they can secure support from bigger powers to protect it for them. That's really most of what there is to it. An illustrative example of this is the erroneous view, common in the West, of the so-called decolonization period of the mid-20th century. The term decolonization here is often understood in the wrong way, to mean the colonial powers voluntarily giving up their colonies kinda out of the goodness of their hearts. This narrative goes that the Western colonial powers willingly relinquished their colonies as they came to the conclusion that colonialism was actually bad, and so of their own free will graciously chose to give their subjects self-determination, because after centuries of colonial genocide, slavery, and exploitation, they'd finally come to the realization that all of what they'd been doing for their own benefit was actually bad, and that they should leave. If that sounds stupid to you, it's because it is, yet many people nonetheless seriously believe it. The reality is that the people of these colonies had struggled against colonial rule for centuries, and they had managed to make that kind of direct rule untenable. In most cases, the colonial power was either forced out via military defeat or evacuated because the resistance had made things very unprofitable. So their reason for so-called decolonization was actually simply because it had become more beneficial for them to cut their losses, leave, and instead try to meddle in those countries through more covert means in order to make them economically dependent on them from afar. Absolutely none of this was out of the goodness of their hearts, and it certainly had nothing to do with them suddenly believing in self-determination after having spent the last few centuries being the very thing that impeded self-determination for most people in the world. But let's try to ignore everything that I just went over about ethics and morality not really mattering for self-determination in practice. Let's pretend that there is, actually, a chance of a consistent set of principles of self-determination being upheld in the real world, because the next segment of this video, which is the entire reason that I'm even talking about Taiwan and Crimea in the first place, kind of depends on it. If it were actually a moral and/or ethical question, which was actually consistently implemented, then who should get the right to self-determination and who shouldn't? My videos are usually about much more cut and dry, falsifiable things, rather than open-ended questions like this one, so this should be fun. First, I want to talk about how this can sometimes be a lot more complicated than just going with what the majority wants. Let's start by looking at our previous examples of Crimea and Taiwan. They're a good choice for this since they're two actually presently existing cases that are very similar in two very key ways. In both cases, a clear majority of residents favor a certain political status. In Crimea, being a part of Russia, and in Taiwan, maintaining the present ambiguous status quo, where the island is run by its own independent government, but is still officially considered a part of China. And in both cases, the dominant societal groups are relatively recent arrivals who usurp the territory from those who were already there. In Crimea, both Ukrainians and Russian moved there and gradually became demographically, socially, and politically dominant after 200 years of settlement that also involved a lot of repression of the Crimean Tatars who were there beforehand. In Taiwan, mainland Chinese settlers aligned with the Kuomintang moved there en masse in 1949 after they lost the civil war to the communists. They established themselves as demographically, socially, and politically dominant over both the pre-existing populations of earlier Chinese migrants and the indigenous Taiwanese. These prior residents resisted this usurpation, so the new arrivals violently took control, crushing the prior inhabitants with extreme violence and repression over a period of 40 years. So the seeming present-day consensus on Taiwan's status was only established through many decades of state violence that only ended in the early 1990s. As you may gather from those descriptions, there's more to this than a simple majority decision, because the majority in these cases is only even a majority due to takeovers from prior populations whose self-determination was certainly never paid any mind to. The Crimean Tatars were never consulted on whether they were okay with Ukrainians and Russians moving in and lording over them, and Taiwan's pre-1949 Chinese and indigenous populations were never asked if they were okay with the Kuomintang and its supporters invading and violently taking over after they lost the civil war. And now we're supposed to just accept this as self-determination because they happen to have crushed any dissenting voices and made themselves the rulers? There are clear problems with simple majority rule in cases like these. If you can conquer a territory, move settlers aligned with you there, crush any dissent, and then later claim self-determination purely on the basis that you now have a majority, then that is a legitimization of the simple notion of might makes right. That having sufficient violent or coercive force to take over a territory should make it yours, provided that you take the extra steps of implanting enough settlers and crushing dissent enough afterwards. So the precedent set if we accept the simple there the majority argument without any broader context is extremely dangerous. Interestingly, international law has at least partially considered cases like these. It is considered a war crime under multiple statutes for an occupying power to implant settlers, which is clearly meant to deter exactly this scenario. But international law is not only practically toothless and rarely ever actually enforced in any meaningful capacity, but it also has other issues. For example, it's not retroactive, meaning any settler implantations from before these laws were drafted are just fine and dandy. That conveniently means that a lot of the country that drafted these laws in the first place get let off the hook because they did exactly that themselves before the laws came into force. So I think it's best to ignore international law and talk about this from a purely ethical standpoint, to focus on what ought to be rather than getting tied up in the semantics of what laws, mostly written at the behest of the world's most powerful countries for their own advantage, happen to say. So there's that element of how the majority actually got there in the first place that makes this all a bit more complicated than simply because the majority says so. But there's also more to it. Another reason is that the political status of a region affects far more than just the people who live there. Crimea, for example, is a very important port region. Access to it and trade with it is hugely beneficial for many millions of people, the vast majority of whom actually reside outside of its borders and who have probably never actually been there. Now that Russia exercises complete control over Crimea, this has created negative economic consequences for everyone in Ukraine, as not only have long-established supply lines had to rapidly change, but all of the trade and taxation brought in by the port is also now going to Russia instead. Ukraine was already an incredibly poor country, and it losing Crimea just makes things even worse for everyone else who lives there. This is similar for many other regions with secession movements of varying popularity and seriousness around the world. If California or Catalonia were to become independent, for example, this would have massive ripple effects that go far beyond affecting just those who happen to live there. These are, relative to the rest of their respective countries, very wealthy regions, and them separating from the biggest states that they're presently a part of would likely bring down the overall standard of living of everyone else, and possibly cause more poverty and make poverty even worse than it already is in those other places. That raises the question of whether everyone else in those states should maybe get at least a partial say in this as well then? Or would that not be fair? Another interesting example to cover here is the Falklands/Malvinas Islands off the coast of Argentina. They are the subject of a very long dispute between Argentina and the British Empire. No one involved actually cares about any of the justifications of who claimed sovereignty first hundreds of years ago, as both sides have their own historical narratives to justify their claim that way, so discussing it simply gets us nowhere, because that's not actually what any of this is about at all. What's much more useful for getting to the crux of the issue is a look at the present-day justifications. A prominent British position today is that the residents of the island should be free to choose their political status, whatever that may be, and that they want to be a part of the UK. So case closed. Aside from the fact that the UK surely would not be pro-self-determination if the majority opinion on the island wasn't so convenient for them, as their stance on many other issues shows, the claim on the face of it is still true. Most people who live on the islands do, very clearly, want to remain a part of the UK. But then that begs the question, how did they get there in the first place? The islands aren't exactly anywhere near the UK after all. Well, they're mostly either more recent British migrants or the descendants of British settlers who were implanted there during the height of the British Empire in the 19th century. It's pretty safe to say, I think, that the British Empire was not motivated in bringing settlers there by a desire to give some poor British people a new life on some isolated, inhospitable Arctic islands. Rather, they were moved there for the explicit purpose of legitimizing the claim of the empire to the islands and their surrounding resources, and to give it a staging ground for further imperial endeavors in the region. After all, the British Empire has literally invaded Argentina and its predecessor states numerous times, and it used the islands as a staging ground to economically and politically dominate the country, along with other South American regions on the Atlantic coast, for more than a century after they were colonized, and they're still used to project British imperial power today. The islands currently house a British military base with around 1,000 personnel right off the coast of South America. How convenient. Today, while the British Empire obviously isn't quite as formidable as it once was, the very problematic origin of the island's present-day status and its continued use to project military power against its historical victims on the other side of the world cannot so simply be ignored. There's clearly more to this than just the people who live there say so. For example, the settlers are also used by Britain as a convenient justification to claim huge amounts of potentially resource-rich territorial waters at the expense of Argentina. The extent of this is truly ridiculous. Britain claims that 3,000 residents give it exclusive economic access to a wider extent of the ocean than what 45 million Argentines in a much greater expanse of territory gives to Argentina. The cover of "it's all for the islanders' self-determination" is clearly dishonest, since obviously 3,000 people could never hope to meaningfully utilize such a massive area of ocean, and this is precisely the case. The UK has long claimed rights to natural resources, such as potential oil deposits around the islands, not in the name of the self-determination of the islanders, but because they hope to bring the profits home to the mainland. The oil reserves that have been discovered there are set to be exploited by UK companies in the near future, bringing substantial amounts of profit from faraway resources back to the British mainland and denying them to Argentina on no basis aside from the fact that the UK happened to implant settlers on some islands far away from it a couple hundred years ago. If that's not a clear example of ongoing colonialism, profit from resources being extracted to the mainland from a colony on the other side of the world, then I don't really know what is. There's also wider geopolitical factors that might be worth considering here. In the case of Taiwan, its existence as a separate entity means that China loses a huge part of its territorial waters and access to whatever resources they hold, which again is going to have some level of economic effect on some of the people who live in China. More significantly though, it means that Taiwan could potentially be used by China's rivals as a staging ground to threaten it, as it factually has been by the US military in the past, and that pretty much continues to this day. One could not imagine that, for example, the USA would not react in much the same way that China does regarding Taiwan if the losing side of the US Civil War had fled to Hawaii, declared independence or that it was the real legitimate government of the USA, and then aligned itself very closely with the US's geopolitical rivals. The way China's stance on Taiwan is often presented as insane and incomprehensible in the Western media is extremely dishonest. They in fact understand it completely. However, in that case, we're really getting more into the realm of campus geopolitics than self-determination. I think the concerns of big powers ideally shouldn't be a factor in questions like these, but in practice, I guess they're probably going to have to play some part if any sort of settlement is ever to be reached. The only real utility of talking about this aside from that is to point out again how opportunistic and insincere these disputes often are. The USA and its allies act like it's absurd that China takes exception to something that they know fully well they would take even more exception to if the shoe were on the other foot. As the US factually does actually do. It's constantly meddling in the affairs of its neighbors, invading them, coupping them, and murdering them, and justifying all of it with them supposedly being too chummy with its enemies. One more case I want to bring up that really can't be ignored is that of Palestine. In 1947, the UN, following decades of lobbying by Zionist colonists, declared, largely at the behest of Western colonial states, who saw a Jewish colonial state as their potential ally, declared the partition of Palestine between a so-called Arab and a Jewish state. The vast majority of the population were Palestinians who had been there going back many generations, and they certainly didn't remotely consent to having their country split in two because some other countries decided that giving half of it to a minority of very recent settlers suited their own interests. Yet the UN vote was nonetheless then used by Israel to justify a massive ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and their still ongoing replacement with said settlers. That's all about as far from self-determination as you could ever possibly get. Applying a simple majority rule sort of understanding of self-determination to Israel would therefore be ridiculous. The existence of Israel is, in fact, the antithesis to the self-determination of Palestinians, and always has been, regardless of whether or not the majority of the implanted settlers who make up most of Israel's population believe in its existence or not. Self-determination in a situation like this can only be expressed with the overwhelming and entirely uncoerced approval of pre-existing and currently oppressed populations, in this case the Palestinians. So in many current claims to self-determination, there's a lot more going on than just what meets the eye at first glance. It's not always, or even most of the time, nearly as simple as the majority of those who live there want it, so I guess that's it. And that's even clearer if you think about some more extreme scenarios. Like, what if a majority somewhere wants to secede for the purposes of being able to more freely oppress a minority, like with the US Confederacy and its desire to maintain racial slavery? Obviously, nothing like that should ever be accepted. So we need a lot of caveats. There are, of course, many pretty unambiguous cases where things are a lot clearer. In fact, the vast majority in modern history have pretty much just been no-brainers. In colonized countries, for example, the desire of the colonized to run their own affairs as much as can be achieved, regardless of how imperfectly they may end up doing so, is clearly infinitely more legitimate than the desire of a colonial overlord to continue to exploit them and their land for labor and resources to bring profit to some faraway motherland. But there is definitely a clear difference between those cases, which are fundamentally defined by brutal oppression and exploitation, and cases like, say, Catalonia or Scotland. Places which are certainly not economically exploited, nor enduring anything even resembling the everyday oppression of colonialism. They're actually very rich, and they themselves have engaged in a whole lot of brutal economic exploitation of the rest of the world as integral and enthusiastic participants of the Spanish and British empires, respectively. It's also different for places like Taiwan and Crimea, whose present status was established by relatively new arrivals via force, and that only even exists due to the interference of much larger powers. States, with their often arbitrary or ethnically defined borders that keep swaths of people in or out with spurious justification, are clearly a highly problematic means of organizing human society. But as long as the world is organized along such lines, national liberation via some form of self-determination, especially of regions kept poor and destitute via foreign domination, is going to remain a fundamentally important concern. Because only once such national subjugation is remedied can we realistically start to think about making further progress towards something better. When people are subjugated on a national, ethnic, or racial basis, fighting that needs to come first. Hence the importance of this discussion, if it wasn't already obviously very important, from the fact that the questions of self-determination of Taiwan, Taiwan, Crimea, and other places are being used, quite dangerously, as footballs in the most important geopolitical conflicts of today between the world's most nuclear-armed states, one of which has proven willing to use nuclear weapons against civilians in the past. There can be no real way forward here without a serious discussion about how we might apply the principle of self-determination in an actually consistent manner. Who should be entitled to it, who shouldn't, and who should get something in between. Interestingly, this is something that no international organization with even a smidgen of influence has ever even really seriously tried to resolve. They in international law use the term self-determination quite often, yet never actually make any real effort to consistently define what it even means. This is another symptom of the fact that it's useful for the big powers to keep such things as ambiguous as possible, as that allows them to more easily take clearly inconsistent positions, like advocating for self-determination for Taiwan but not for Crimea, or vice versa. I don't really have any definitive answer to the questions that I've raised here, because this is all going to be very subjective. Nor do I think it's possible for one person like me to put forth some sort of simple self-determination checklist that we could just go down and apply to every single case. Since not only would it be pretty egotistical on my part to think that I could solve such a complicated problem all by myself, but also, as we've gone over here, there's such a wide variety of potential factors and caveats to consider that it would surely end up being very easy to poke holes in any such list. What I can do is give my opinion and reasoning on the two big cases that we've gone over here, which could perhaps at least start a discussion and get people thinking more about these problems. So what I think is that in the case of Crimea, them being allowed to join Russia is both wrong and sets a very bad precedent, and not solely or even at all due to the whole military invasion thing. For one, the history of the region where both Ukrainians and Russians are only really there due to the Russian Empire. There's a clear issue with people moving somewhere that was annexed by an empire until they become a majority, and then their newfound majority status there being used to justify annexation to the successor state of said empire. Any decision on Crimea's status should give special attention to the Crimean Tatar population for this reason. For two, independence is one thing, but joining a different country is another, and especially when it's a large, aggressive, much more powerful, and much wealthier regional power like Russia. In this case, there's clearly more to it than a simple desire for self-determination. We're talking about a population that includes a majority of Russians that are clearly quite motivated by the better economic opportunity that being a part of Russia offers them too. The Russian state's ambitions being aligned with theirs is likely no coincidence. It stood to gain a lot from riling them up and trying to convince them to join Russia. In doing so, it also significantly weakened and destabilized Ukraine, which is also pretty useful for its geopolitical ambitions. The principle of self-determination should have little to do with scenarios like this. It really shouldn't even be invoked, because the change of status here is much more for a combination of simple convenience, material benefits, and ethnic allegiance than anything else. Rather, it should apply much more so to clear cases of subjugation, such as with colonialism or occupation. Most Crimeans may not have preferred their previous status as a part of Ukraine, but they certainly were not enduring anything resembling that level of oppression, or even any oppression at all, regardless of the completely made-up narratives that Russia's sympathizers have to that respect. The differences between them being a part of Ukraine or of Russia are comically minor to them in comparison to actual national liberation movements. Anti-colonial fighters across the world rose up against hundreds of years of brutal domination. For them, self-determination was quite literally a matter of independence or death. For Crimeans, the most meaningful difference is which government pays their pension and fixes their roads. Very little has really changed. That's simply not what the principle should be for. If what they wanted was instead independence, and I mean actual independence, not just independence for the sake of hurting Ukraine and becoming a Russian proxy state, I would be more sympathetic, but my opinion overall still wouldn't really be too different. I still don't think they have a particularly good reason to want to be independent, for most of the same reasons mentioned prior, nor am I even sure they would want it, because outright independence has never been a very popular choice on any of the polls that I've seen. Having a different ethnic majority or a different identity is simply not a good enough justification on its own. We should be moving away from having these ethnically defined states whenever possible, rather than supporting the formation of yet another one breaking off on ethnic grounds. There's nothing wrong with having a place in Ukraine with a majority of ethnic Russians, or a place in Russia with a majority of ethnic Ukrainians, and you can apply that logic to literally anywhere else in the world and it's the same. This is especially problematic because, again, the ethnic majority of Russians in Crimea is itself only a majority because it displaced people who were there beforehand. So any true independence movement would need to actually be started and led by Crimean Tatars to have a solid basis as a real expression of the region's self-determination. Additionally, it should be noted that Ukraine gained Crimea in the first place in possibly the least controversial circumstances ever. It was handed over to it by the legitimate Russian government of the time, completely of their own free will, explicitly as a gesture of goodwill. A big country voluntarily giving a much smaller country a part of its territory without any violence involved certainly doesn't happen every day. I do not think Russia should be allowed to just decide it wants it back at a later date, and even less so because this is a symptom of its politics since having shifted to be far more right-wing and nationalist. As for Taiwan, Taiwan's foundations are even more problematic than those that established the Russian majority in Crimea. They are much more recent, as up until the late 80s they were still a military dictatorship that was ruthlessly crushing all local opposition to their invasion while suppressing local customs and culture and trying to replace them with their own. It also has, since the beginning, depended entirely on foreign backing. It's been used as a convenient wedge against the People's Republic of China from the get-go, enjoying unconditional Western support solely for that reason, to the extent that it could really barely be considered any less of a proxy state than Russia's satellite republics and Ukraine. For decades, while the new government was violently imposing its rule on the island, the USA protected it from a potential local uprising that it couldn't handle or a communist counter-invasion with warships, and most Western countries even claimed for decades after the Civil War that it was still the legitimate government of all of China. Taiwan's constitution still claims this, in fact, and the country's official name remains the Republic of China. Today, Taiwan still acts as a proxy for Western interests, no less than a nominally independent Crimea likely would for Russia. So, Taiwan was formed by the practically fascist losing side of a civil war, who took it over via extreme violence, and then claimed to be the government in exile of China. Only through this extreme violence and repression did they manufacture the majority consent that appears in opinion polls today. Should we just forget about all of that? Because conveniently, only after they had mercilessly crushed the opposition, they decided to become a liberal democracy 30 years ago. I don't really think that's how it should work. If the Confederates had, in some weird parallel universe, invaded a nearby island after losing the Civil War, violently taken power there while claiming to be the real US government, then abolished slavery, established equal rights, and transitioned to democracy a while later, I also would not so simply support their so-called self-determination either. China also clearly has a much more sensible claim to Taiwan than Russia has to Crimea. While Russia gave up Crimea more willingly than nearly any state has ever given up territory pretty much ever, the Taiwanese case is very different. Under international conventions established since at least the 19th century, a successor government inherits all of the previous territory of the government that it replaces, which includes Taiwan, as despite having been occupied for a long time previously, it was historically claimed by a succession of Chinese states and was returned to Chinese governance in 1945. Now, I don't particularly care about that justification myself, as I'm not a huge fan of the largely useless thing called international law in general. I think that competing nationalistic territorial claims should be largely irrelevant when it comes purely to the theoretical, ethical side of self-determination. But it's interesting to bring up because a lot of those that do actually condemn China for continuing to make this claim, such as all of the Western states that back Taiwan, absolutely do claim to care a lot about international law incessantly. Yet in this case, that of course goes out the window because it's too convenient for their geopolitical rival. So I think of Taiwanese independence much like how I think of Crimean independence. If it was well and truly an initiative of pre-invasion peoples and undertaken wholly independently of foreign powers, then great. Otherwise, probably not. This may be very unlikely, if not impossible, as the Kuomintang did a pretty thorough job of destroying local political resistance and cultural identity during its 40-year-long reign of terror. But this is pretty theoretical musing on what ought to be, rather than what's practicable, and it would make absolutely no sense to be against so-called self-determination in Crimea, but not in Taiwan. On the practical side of things, there seems to be no real way that Crimea will be rejoining Ukraine, at least as long as Vladimir Putin is alive, that wouldn't require a military invasion. One that would probably be opposed by the civilian population, and which thus would probably be a lot more violent than the original Russian one. While it is unjust that Russia has taken Crimea, more war would likely simply destroy the region as it has much of the rest of Ukraine. Such destruction would absolutely not be worth the transfer of some territory from one state to another. Perhaps in the future, Crimea could be negotiated over, or some form of true, non-puppet independence could be achieved, free of the undue influence of Russia, Ukraine, or the West. But for now, its status as a part of Russia seems to have been solidified, all simply because Russia had the power to take it. As for Taiwan, the status quo there will likely be maintained for the foreseeable future, unless its government, probably at the behest of the USA, does something incredibly stupid like declaring independence, knowing full well that this will probably result in a military response from the PRC. Perhaps in the future, some form of negotiations can be had or something, but the fact of the matter is that Taiwan's ambiguous status and conflict with China make it incredibly useful for the USA, especially due to China recently becoming a much more formidable world power. Nothing resembling a settlement on Taiwan will ever be possible while this meddling exists, as resolving the issue would deprive the US of its entire reason for caring about Taiwan in the first place. The usefulness of having a proxy state right off the Chinese coast that also makes China really mad. And I hope this goes without saying, but regardless of who's in the right or wrong here, China absolutely should not invade Taiwan, Ukraine absolutely should not invade Crimea, and Russia shouldn't have invaded Crimea nor the rest of Ukraine in the first place. None of these issues are or even were remotely pressing enough to have warranted anything resembling actual war. Between starting a war and just begrudgingly leaving things as they are, the second option is/was clearly the best in these cases, since there was not anything resembling pressing issues of subjugation or oppression to deal with. Ultimately, I think the problem with the principle of self-determination as we tend to understand it is that it tries to cover too many highly dissimilar cases all in one neat little principle, something that, in practice, seems impossible. It was a term originally coined to refer primarily to actual bona fide colonial subjugation, where there was really no question at all about what the majority wanted and whether they should be allowed to have it. But now it's been extended far beyond that grasp to what are often just regionalist or nationalistic separatist movements, rather than actual victims of colonialism, occupation, or other types of unambiguous subjugation. There is really nothing in common between, say, the Kenyans who fought against British colonialism and the cases of Crimea and Taiwan, nor between Palestinians fighting Israeli colonialism and other modern cases like Catalonia or Scotland. Regardless of how much Catalans and Scots laughably like to paint themselves as akin to the people they themselves colonized, the fact of the matter is that they were eager and equal participants in their respective states' colonialism, and are today quite well off as a result. They've never been in a situation remotely analogous to those of their historical victims. So my view on their independence is basically just meh. Nothing really meaningful is going to change for them either way. I don't particularly oppose it, but I don't particularly support it either. I guess weakening Britain and Spain would be pretty cool though. So, to finish up, here's a summary of what we've gone over. It's clear that most people in Crimea want to join Russia, and most people in Taiwan want to maintain the present status quo rather than joining China outright. It's also clear that the present consensus in these places was formed in very similar problematic circumstances. So in both cases, a consistent position must be taken. Either both majorities in Crimea and Taiwan get their wish, or neither do. The fact that, in practice, nearly every party with an opinion on the matter thinks that only one or the other should is an amazing example of how little consistent principles actually matter at the end of the day, not just in the case of self-determination, but rather with everything. It's all opportunism, and it's the exact same in every single other case in the world today. In general, there are also many other factors that should be taken into consideration regarding questions of self-determination, aside from just majority rules, and many different contexts that range from active life or death anti-colonial liberation struggles to simple regionalist political disputes, where the real motivation is just that people want to pay less tax and/or sometimes even just be more racist. This makes it practically impossible to form any remotely consistent checklist to apply to decide when a majority or plurality of residents should get to decide their broader political status or not. And this isn't even considering much more complicated factors, like the fact that such sentiments can be highly manipulated by those in control of the flow of information, or that have been pretty much exclusively referring to a very statist conception of self-determination. There are a lot more nuances that are unfortunately very hard to cover all at once in just a YouTube video, so I chose to keep the focus on how things actually tend to be today. So yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about with this video. Sorry that I can't leave you with any definitive answers. These are all pretty open-ended questions surrounding concepts that are clearly pretty flawed, that could do with a genuine discussion on how to refine them, and perhaps even more importantly, on how to actually ensure that they might be consistently applied in practice. So maybe go away, think about this a bit yourself, and then go talk about that in the comments down below with everyone else. I'm definitely not just trying to get you to give me engagement so that the video gets pushed more in the algorithm or anything. I promise I would never do that. See you next time. Thank you to all of my supporters on Patreon and Ko-fi for making videos like this possible, and especially my $25 plus supporters, Robo-Commie, Gel Cribson, A Big Mean Cat, Mischief and Fins, Brosnan, Aismalard, Darcius B, Evan Carroll, William Tomlinson, Arthur Simac Jones, Diego X, Jake Chowdhuin, Bantam, Exos, and my $10 plus patrons, Cab the Bird Ranger, Shub, Deep Sea J, JG, Michael Strauss, Melissa Gomez, Can't Care Less, XXXX, Average is Awesome, Naomi Starlight, Justin Bailey 77, Naomi Starlight, George Rosenbaum, Ugopnik, Adam Heitzman, Nabiru, B, Johnny Rocket, Firefox 42, and Open-Minded Communist. Thank you all once again for your support. It really helps. It's what allows me to keep this channel going at all. So yeah, see you next time.